He was employed as a program analyst for a nonpartisan legislative service agency in Wisconsin. His research interests include state politics, voting behavior, and science and environmental policy. He's going to speak with us today about the Walker to Evers transition and how the environmental policy has changed in Wisconsin. So I'm going to hand it over to Jonah now. And again, he'll tell you how he wants to format his talk, and enjoy.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I'm glad to be here today with you, even if it is virtually. We've all had to adjust to a new way of life, that's for sure, but hopefully 2021 brings us back to some normalcy. Today, what I'll be talking about, as was mentioned, what is the transition from the Walker to Evers administration and what that means in terms of environmental policy. I'll be focusing a lot on what Walker did and what Evers is trying to do. I'll also, in the beginning, try to contextualize state environmental policy in case this isn't an area like me who studies it, but maybe it's not an area you're as familiar with. So I'll just kind of give you, some contextualization, a little bit of the landscape in environmental policy in Wisconsin. Okay, so I'm going to try to share my screen here. I've got a presentation for you. It's not very lengthy, so that should be sharing now. I'm going to go ahead and change it to, there we go, slideshow format. And okay, good. So we're seeing the presentation. Excellent. Like I said, I only have about 8 or 9 slides, so it's again, if the presentation dies out on it's not a big deal. I can still speak to it. Okay, so again, just to contextualize things, prior to the 1970s, so this would have been the environmental decade, as we call it in the United States, mostly state and local governments were responsible for environmental policy.
Up there.
And you can see that the reason why eventually there is a movement towards federal regulation is because in many cases states had chosen little to no regulation. So it was kind of problematic. So anyone who may have lived through this time period may recall that there was a lot of smog in New York City. There was a lot of pollution in the rivers. Our own state of Wisconsin experienced this because we had one of the largest concentrations of paper mills in the world, not just the country, along the Fox River Valley basin. And so that Fox River Valley area became heavily polluted with PCBs and other things like that. And the fear of leaving it to the states was that there would be a race to the bottom, meaning to attract industries, states had an incentive to reduce their environmental regulation down to the minimum, and in some cases basically letting businesses do whatever they want, whether that be a mining operation or that be large factory that's going to pollute with chemical waste or air pollution, those kind of things. And so the reason why we had that federal government move in was because of this issue. And the reason I bring it up is because we're going to return to that issue under the Walker administration. But here's something to keep in mind when I do end up talking about the Walker administration and the environmental policy during that time period, that state legislation, because of this federal intervention and because of the creation of the EPA, and the number of environmental laws that happened in the 70s, because of all of that federal regulation, and because of our constitutional system, whereby the federal law takes precedence, it means that states have to be at least as stringent as that minimum federal bar. So the federal government now sets minimum standards that all states must meet. And in some really conservative states, you even have some laws in the books that say that the state can go no further than the federal law. Those are mostly places in the South. But if you look at Wisconsin, historically, we have been one of those governments that has more regulation than the federal government. So we've been an environmental policy innovator. You could think back to, Governor Gaylord North Nelson, who eventually becomes, senator for Wisconsin, and the creation of Earth Day. You could think back to Aldo Leopold and John Muir, and so the creation of the Sierra Club. There's all these wonderful environmentalists that come out of Wisconsin, and that had a, pretty large impact on the fact that Wisconsin was part of the conservation stewardship movement, land ethic movement, and strong regulator for environmental policy. We still see some evidence of this today. Number of municipalities in the states have moved towards 100% clean energy policies. So that's like the city of Madison, for example, which goes beyond what our current, federal government's doing, but also beyond what the state is doing as well, because they have a shorter timeline for the city. But there are other municipalities in the state that have also done this. So, we walked away from some of that legacy during the Walker administration, but it doesn't mean that it was, that the entire apparatus for state environmental regulation and policy was somehow dismantled. It wasn't, right? It was changed, and I'll talk about that. But there is still, a strong focus on protection of the environment. It's just a bit weakened after the Walker administration compared to what it was before. State laws are really important. So some state laws implement federal programs. That's the case in Wisconsin. We have, as I'm sure you're aware, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And so some of those federal programs that I'm talking about, like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, in Wisconsin, we do have a lead environmental agency that's adequately staffed, funded, and is able to design the program to meet those standards. And so just another point too, right? During the Walker administration, only so much could be done to dismantle the apparatus for regulation of the environment in the state, because if the state were to fail to meet its obligations, in fact, the EPA would take control back from the state to make sure that these federal laws are being enforced. So you can always, rest assured that there's some minimum federal standard. Now, of course, which we're not going to talk about today, there were the outgoing Trump administration, there were many attempts to roll back and reverse environmental protections, right? And so you can change those federal standards, and then that thereby creates a lower minimum standards for all the states. But again, there will always be some federal standard because that's required by federal law, and the states have to abide by that federal law. Now, why do some states choose to put in stronger environmental laws than these federal minimums? One study found that wealthier states that had strong environmental interest groups, again, like the Sierra Clubs, right, or clean water groups, these kind of things, if there's a large manufacturing presence, meaning there's a lot of entities to be regulated, and there's democratic governments, because Democrats tend to be, and at least in the modern political environment right now, tend to be much more supportive of environmental policy. Those places, those states are likely to have high policy support. So we could see that there is a political element to this. And of course, that explains a lot of the change from Walker to Evers, is really just the governorship changing from a Republican governor to a Democratic governor. Of course, historically, this really doesn't fit well with how the two parties have often been a bipartisan movement for this. It was, after all, Richard Nixon who created the EPA, and Tommy Thompson had a fairly good record on the environment during his tenure as a Wisconsin governor. And so it's not always been that Democrats were for the environment and Republicans were against it, right? That is more of a recent phenomenon. You could trace it back to more of the beginnings of it in the 1990s, but it particularly took off in the 2000s. And you see the League of Conservation Voters, for example, that does voting scorecards for how representatives and senators vote in the federal level. They've found that Republicans are overwhelmingly not in favor of stronger environmental protections at the federal level. and that Democrats overwhelmingly are in favor of stronger environmental policy. And so, again, this divide has only been in the last couple decades. Before, the environment was often a bipartisan issue. And in fact, many prominent Republicans, like Teddy Roosevelt, for example, were some of the leaders of the movement to have stronger environmental policy. But that's shifted, and we'll talk about how Walker represents that shift, right? He represents the shift to Republicans being very antagonistic towards environmental protection. So just to give you an example of a state law, this is not one of ours, but I will talk about ours. Just want to show that states can choose to go beyond that federal minimum standard of environmental regulation. One state that we're probably all familiar with that's pretty strong in environmental protections is California. And they have this California Proposition 65 that was passed by voters because it's an initiative. And it requires companies to disclose if they have things in their product that can cause environmental harm or public health harm. And so you see these types of warnings. And because California, on its own, if it was its own country, it would be one of the world's largest economies on its own. Because it's so important to the US economy, manufacturers really can't afford to create these disclosures on their products and then sell them separately to other states without the disclosures. So this one state law has impacted pretty much most of the products in the United States that have these types of chemicals, right? These potential carcinogens, meaning cancer causing. So in fact, what we see is that state laws can be so impactful, right, that they can impact every state in the nation to some degree. And that's what this California Proposition 65 has done. So if you look on a can of spray paint or something like that, you'll see these warnings, and that's why. In our own state, we have the Wisconsin Environmental Policy Act. Now, this followed on the heels of the National Environmental Policy Act. That really began the modern era of environmental policy. I'll talk a little bit about what it does, but I want to focus again on Wisconsin. And that outlines our state's environmental policy. And you can, if you read the statute that created this, you'll get a better understanding of what it is and what it tries to accomplish. But I'll give you a brief overview here today, and this will kind of set the stage for some of the stuff we'll talk about, because there were changes to this under the Walker administration. But what WEPA does is it requires state agencies to gather and consider environmental information in their decision making. And this doesn't apply to you like, digging a hole in your backyard to create a little pond or something like that. But it does apply to, large actions involving state agency regulation, funding, or issuance of a permit. And that's, those are that's pretty comprehensive. So a number of things do get included in this. And it kind of uses this cost benefit approach. Now, the point is not to direct projects to a particular place or to stop projects, but what it really is trying to do is make people aware, particularly the developers, whether that be state or private entity, aware of the environmental impact of their proposed actions. And so it's going to provide incentives to decrease environmental damage. And another key part of this is that citizens are given input into the policy process. So not only does it put environmental protection at the forefront of the state's decision making, and also the entities that are regulated by the state, but it also allows citizens through public comment and hearings and other things like that. It allows them to participate in the process and to make sure their concerns are not ignored, right? That they're included in this decision-making process. And so this is kind of the backbone of some of the environmental protection framework of Wisconsin. And you can see in this graph, well, maybe you can, I don't know, this is not, the contrast here may be difficult, but hopefully you can see here that Wisconsin is one of just a handful of states that do this. So less than half of the US states have some kind of comprehensive environmental review statute. We're one of those, meaning, again, there is this legacy of Wisconsin being a policy innovator on environmental policy and having strong environmental protections. And that, you could also see the states that are here, a number of them are the kinds of states we would typically think of as being strong on environmental regulation, like California, Oregon, Massachusetts, Minnesota. So what happens with those, with WEPA? What happens with that is that you have to make there's certain actions, and I'm not going to go through those. What warrants an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. An environmental assessment is more of a cursory review that's just deciding whether or not an environmental impact statement's needed. And with those assessments, with those impact statements, that's a formal process, and that's where you have, again, the kind of the cost benefit approach, the pros, the cons. You have the inclusion of the public. And so, again, this can lead to a longer process. It can lead to a more comprehensive assessment of environmental impact. But these decisions are political. There's just no question that they are. And I don't think we should pretend that they're not, because a decision has to be made as to whether or not to go through this process, and who is working at the DNR, who's the head agents, the leader of the agency, and who are the the administration that is responsible for these decisions. All of that matters, and we can see that the BNSF train track expansion in La Crosse is a good example. Okay, that is a pristine marshland out, near La Crosse, and they were going to be hauling a lot of oil through that pathway, and the risk of an oil spill obviously increases as you're hauling more oil, and you're creating more track to haul that oil. There was no environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, and that became controversial. And so some Democrats were calling for this, like Ron Kine, Tammy Baldwin, but their argument for this fell on deaf ears because it's ultimately a state decision. And so the state chose not to carry out that environmental assessment or environmental impact statement, even though, right, there was pressure to do so. And so again, you can see how this becomes political. Another example, so there was this Sandpiper oil pipeline that had been proposed up near Superior. It had an environmental impact statement. It was actually a small little, extension. It didn't cover a whole lot of the state. But you have line 61, which goes through, near Madison, near us, and where we are, and that line goes across the state, and it was, it's going to be carrying more oil than the proposed Keystone XL project, which obviously, is quite controversial. So that had no environmental impact statement. There was an existing oil pipeline there. That was part of the argument, right? That they were just expanding an existing line. But this is not without controversy because of how big this expansion would be in terms of the volume of oil, and also because Enbridge, the company responsible for this pipeline, also was responsible for one of the largest inland oil spills in U.S. history. So you had 1 million gallons of oil spilled and over $1 billion for restoration in the Kalamazoo, Michigan area as a result of a large spill they had there for the pipeline. So Dane County tried to require some insurance for this, so $25 million. But a last-minute Wisconsin state budget provision blocked towns and counties from doing that. So the state usurped the authority of localities to have any regulation over this pipeline going near them. And this is the beginnings of what we can see with some of the stance of the Walker administration, right? It was incredibly pro-business, and it was also very much driven by the state political actors and their ideologies, more than it was about municipalities having a say in things. So you can see it was very authoritarian in the sense that the state government would usurp local authority if it needed to make sure that the political actors were able to get the outcome they wanted, right? This being these, conservative legislature and the governor. And again, another example of this, of the state consolidating its authority over the environmental framework and then also turning it to be more of a pro-business economic development bent, was that there were changes made under Governor Walker in 2014 to WEPA, which I had just been talking about, and less actions require an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement. They also reduce the opportunity for the public to be part of this process. And so, again, we can start to see the seeds of what the Walker administration was trying to accomplish. I'm going to go more depth into that now. There we go. Okay, so I'll stay on this slide for a while, actually, the next two slides. So I just have two more slides. So there's a lot of stuff on here, but I'm going to go through all of them. And during the Walker administration, I think one of the more controversial things that was proposed during the administration was the proposed mine. So you may remember this, right? The mine project that had been proposed in northern Wisconsin. It was going to be, iron ore mining, and it was heavily contested by the people in that region, particularly indigenous peoples, things like that. And it was very controversial at the time, although it did have pretty solid Republican support. And it was really pushed by a few key legislators, including the Senate Majority Leader, Scott Fitzgerald, and others, and Assembly Leader, And so then you also had, well, of course, Walker heavily pushing this. And what it did, so this was a state law that did get passed. Well, I guess maybe I should, I'll go back to what the writing of the bill itself, but I'll get to that in a minute. But I'll say what it did first, which is that it rescinded what Wisconsin had at the time, which was a sulfide mining moratorium law. And it was a prove it first law. It was actually the first of its kind in the world. So again, going back to Wisconsin being an environmental policy innovator and leader, this speaks to that. And this was passed during the Thompson administration. So it was a bipartisan effort. And what it did is it required any new mining operation before it could take place would have to find a sulfide mining operation in the world that had not disturbed the environment and caused significant environmental harm. But of course, as we know, with sulfide mining, there is no example of this. Unfortunately, this is the process of this mining creates sulfuric acid, which is basically battery acid, right? And there's just no good way to do this type of mining without having acid drainage and other problems that affect heavy metals, other things like that, that affect the water quality in the surrounding region. And so this mining operation would undoubtedly have caused environmental harm. There's just no question. There's a reason why the company could not find an example and was unable to work with the existing law. So if you don't like the existing law, what's your alternative then? Well, you try to change the law. And so that's exactly what happened. And they had, so the mining company had very friendly, again, this kind of pro-business, pro-economic development legislature and governor who were more than willing to get rid of this moratorium law. And what we found out eventually is that the mining company itself largely wrote the law. And how we know this is because Scott Fitzgerald, the leader in the Senate, Republican leader in the Senate, actually, he was pressed. He kind of slipped in one of his comments and said, as the company was building that law, and so people seized on that and they started badgering him, saying, and there were no sponsors, which was also very strange. So there's a legislator or a group of legislators often, right, that sponsor legislation, meaning they help to write it and have input into it. And then you see in this case that there were no sponsors. It was just the committee listed. And so they started badgering the Senate Majority Leader, asking him, well, who wrote this law? Did the company write this law? And basically at some point he finally just says, yeah, they wrote it. So we know, from the Senate Majority Leader's own mouth, but also from records that were found with communication between the company and state officials, that in fact, yes, they did have a bunch of changes and things, and actually did write the law in large part. So you had this company writing this law for their own benefit, that would undoubtedly cause environmental harm. So that is very symbolic to me of the Walker administration, right? And of course the people that were very supportive of this would say that's good, right? That there are too many environmental regulations, there are too many environmental policies, and in fact these things need to be rescinded because they're too restrictive, and we need the jobs more than we need the wetlands in that area or whatever it might be, right? So I don't want to make light of the fact that some people were very supportive of this kinds of things. It's not as if there was overwhelming consensus that this was a bad policy or something like that. There wasn't. It wouldn't have passed if there had been. But there were critics, and one of those was Senator Dale Schultz, who himself was Republican. And he said of the company's influence, I've never seen anything like this done by special interests in Wisconsin in 32 years. So that speaks to how remarkable this process was, and how much the position of the Wisconsin state officials had changed from a pro-environmental bent to one that now was going to favor business, and favor it to such a degree that they would even let a company write their own law that they wanted in place. And so what this would have been, which again, it didn't even go through in the end. So all of this effort was done and the company backed out of this in the end. But what they wanted to do was build a $1.5 billion iron ore mine. So there are a couple of these, for example, in Minnesota, historical ones, right? It'd be harder to get those in place nowadays, probably. And they lobbied, for this permitting process. So this is actually what they ended up getting, because again, they helped to write the law. They got the permitting process down from 7 years or more to just less than a year. So you can imagine that going from a very lengthy process where you're trying to minimize environmental impact, particularly on surrounding communities, but of course also on wildlife and the environment itself. If you have a very lengthy process for that, there's more you can do to try to ensure that the mining operation has a less of an impact. Bringing it down to less than a year, you're fast tracking it. And there is the potential, right, that things will get approved in the rush to get it approved that are in fact going to have very detrimental long-term consequences on the environment. So that didn't pass. The company did back out. So even though this law went through, the company did back out. So maybe it's not something that it has anything to do with the Evers administration, but certainly you can imagine that company would have been worried, if the process, of the potential for regulation down the road under a different administration. We also had, during the Walker administration, pretty significant budget cuts, and the DNR was one of those targets So 92 positions from the DNR were removed in the 2015 to 17 budget. So we have a biennium budget here every 2 years. And 18 of those were senior scientist positions. So again, we can see the point, the chief, the leader of the DNR at that time was pretty ideological. And so you can again see this movement towards very politicizing environmental issues and minimizing them. So that's the two words I would use, is politicizing and minimizing. That's what was most common during the Walker administration. So things were politicized, meaning environmental regulations and everything like that were first viewed through an ideological lens of, is this going to allow more economic development, or is it going to restrict economic development? And if it was restrictive, then of course that was something they would prefer not to do. And so they would try to find ways to ensure that anything that promoted economic development is what was prioritized and what was put in place. And one way to do that is through so minimizing that environmental protection through getting rid of some of the enforcement mechanisms, getting rid of the employees responsible for that regulation. So you don't have to necessarily get rid of the regulation itself, right? It's the old kill the beast strategy. You just defund it. And so if you defund the agency, it's not able to accomplish what it is set out to do. Now, I have a graphic there showing you that this is not just hypothetical. I mean, this actually happened. So what they did is they removed these positions, removed scientists, and they prioritize economic development. And what happens is you have a dramatic drop in the number of pollution enforcement violations. So they just stopped citing people for violating the law. And that's problematic, right? Because not only does it encourage additional violations, but it also allows environmental harm to occur. And again, you can see how this might work, right? You don't necessarily have to change the law, but you can restrict the enforcement of the law. And that's basically the same thing. But one way, some other laws they did actually change was the 2016 law that prevented cities from banning plastic bags. That law was something that a number of other states have done as well, but it was in the most conservative states that we saw this happen. And so it prevents, say, the city of Madison or the city of Milwaukee from banning plastic bags. And that's why you can't really have in Wisconsin any plastic bag bans. It's a small issue, but it's again one of these things where the plastic bag manufacturers were heavily lobbying to make sure that this law was passed because they wanted their product protected. And so it's again another case of a particular economic interest getting their interest protected over the potential environmental harm that their product may cause. And the reason why this is an importance to Wisconsin is, a lot of the pollution that gets into, the lakes, our beautiful Great Lakes that surround us, is tied to things like this, right? Where you have plastic bags blowing off the street and into the water, and it affects wildlife. And of course, those plastics don't really break down to degrade fully. They just break down into little microplastics, right? A little smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. So it is an environmental problem, but it's one that our state is not addressing. Of course, the Foxconn deal, you can't go without talking about the Foxconn deal and the Walker administration. Now, what we know is that this ended up being a bit of a boondoggle, right? I mean, it didn't work. It was kind of like the iron mining thing. So they bent over backwards for this mining company who eventually doesn't come. We see the same story play out here. They bend over backwards for Foxconn, and then Foxconn doesn't really fulfill any of its major obligations, right? It doesn't really build the big factories it's talking about. It didn't bring all the employment that it was going to bring. And it looks very unlikely, particularly with President Trump now leaving the office of the White House, well, whether by force or on his own accord, but he will leave January 20th, right? And with him leaving the office, what we'll find is that I think there'll be less pressure on Foxconn, because a lot of that was between Walker and Trump to negotiate this, and particularly Trump was driving a lot of this to have Foxconn come to the U.S. And so, this is probably not going to happen. Um, and it's probably better off for the state in the long run. If you look at the way Foxconn has treated the places that it's gone, it's always failed to fulfill its promises. The company has. It's also caused a lot of environmental harm and damage everywhere it's gone. Um, and an analysis, nonpartisan, objective analysis from the state agency found that this investment that we were planning for Foxconn wouldn't have been recouped until 2043. And that's pretty astounding when you think about it, right? To put in this amount of investment in a project that within just a couple of years we know has already not meeting its obligations, right? A more recent change that happened before Evers, I should mention, I'm not going to talk about it much, was the easier development of wetlands. And so you had 6 sportsman organizations oppose this, actually. And that's something we can be proud of in Wisconsin, is the rich hunting heritage, and also that many of those hunters are in fact some of the more ardent and avid conservationists, because as we know, you need these kinds of pristine forests and wetlands and other things for wildlife to flourish, and in particular for duck hunters and things like that. You need wetlands. And what this law changed and allows now is just the easier development of those wetlands, and so you don't have to protect them as much as you did previously. And so businesses will find it easier to get the permits to fill in these wetlands or to drain them, right? And this is why sportsmen organizations were opposed to this effort, because they were concerned about the impact that would have on a lot of the bird populations in the state that they hunt. Okay, so with my remaining time, I will transition to the Evers administration, and then I'll try to end it in about 8 to 10 minutes here, so that we still leave time for questions. And so now I'll just go through the policies under the Evers administration. So one of the biggest that he did, at least in my view, is this Executive Order 38 relating to clean energy in Wisconsin. So I actually have the order. I'm not going to read any of it, but it's in the typical style of an executive order, meaning it says whereas, so that's like a resolution, right? It says whereas this issue, well, I'll read the first sentence. It says, whereas climate change poses a serious threat to Wisconsin's natural resources, public health, communities, tourism, and economy. And then the order goes on to list all of the impacts that climate change is likely to have in Wisconsin. And this is all science-based evidence that it's being cited in this. And so I actually do recommend you read this. You can find these, these are public documents, obviously. So you can find Executive Order 38 and 58 that I'm referring to here. But he creates, it says, now, therefore, I, Tony Evers, governor of the state of Wisconsin, by the authority vested in me by the Constitution and laws of the state, hereby order the Department of Administration to create the Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy. The Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy shall be charged with the following. And he mentions, a number of different things, A through F here, in partnership with other state agencies and state utilities, achieve a goal of ensuring all electricity consumed within the state of Wisconsin is 100% carbon-free by 2050. Ensure the state of Wisconsin is fulfilling the carbon reduction goals of the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. Develop a clean energy plan, promote a clean energy workforce, foster innovation, research, and business development, develop energy efficiency, sustainability, and renewable energy standards. So you can see it does a lot. And it's pretty consequential because, we go from an administration, the Walker administration, which, there were folks deleting scientific references to global warming on state websites. Now we go from that stance where we don't even want to acknowledge the science to creating this Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy and actually putting in a clean energy goal and making sure that we are, in accordance with the Paris Climate Accords, which is the largest international effort at the moment, right, to try to curb carbon emissions so that we can try to minimize the degree to which the Earth's climate warms. And of course, all the various negative effects that will be caused by that global warming. He also signed into Executive Order 58, relating the creation of the governor's task force on climate change. This had 32 members. And I believe I've got, yeah, here we go, who the task force shall include. And here we go. So the task force shall be chaired by the lieutenant governor and the 2 members of the Wisconsin State Assembly, so 1 representing each caucus, so it was bipartisan in that regard. Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, and so different various interests represented from the business community, agricultural community, native nations, institutions of higher education, things like that. And also there were 2 members from the state Senate, 1 from each caucus, meaning again, there's some bipartisanship to this. So 32 members in total. They had 55 recommendations in a December 2020 report. So that report just came out last month. So if you haven't had a chance, I would recommend checking that out. It's in local news. And the issue with this, though, and I think I need to bring this up because it's very relevant to the Evers administration as a whole, is that the conservative legislator, and we're talking, they almost have a supermajority. They don't, which will be very important for redistricting coming up, but they almost have supermajorities in both the Senate and the Assembly, meaning they're almost at the 2/3 level. So that's how Republican the state legislature is right now. And it's quite a conservative legislature. So in response to this executive order and this task force, Assembly Leader Voss said, "There's no doubt in my mind that Governor Evers did this for political reasons. There's no real task for the task force. Like, what's your ultimate goal?" I would say, I don't know if climate change is real. I think it probably is. I have no idea why it is occurring, nor do most people on the planet. Now, of course, that statement is false. And climate change is happening because of human emissions of greenhouse gases to the environment, right? The science is very clear on that. But there's skepticism, there's doubt in the legislature. And that's going to make it difficult for Evers. There's only so much you can do through the executive branch. I think President Trump discovered that to some extent as well, right? That once you don't have control of the legislature, of both chambers, right? You do lose some power to make certain changes, right? You can change regulation, but it's difficult to change the laws, right? And so to make real impact, there probably would need to be some legislative changes, right? And that's just very unlikely to happen at the moment. And that's going to be a ongoing challenge for Evers, particularly after the results of this latest election, where Republicans solidified their majorities. They didn't actually lose seats, right? And then with the Evers administration, so I don't want to leave, with that kind of sour note, right? What instead I'd like to focus on saying that there is this water quality focus from the governor. He declared, 2019 the year of clean drinking water. There was a package of bills. So the Assembly actually put together this task force, and a package of bills, multi-million-dollar package of bills, was put forward. It passed overwhelmingly in the Assembly. So this is a good sign, right? There are some areas of environmental policy that the 2 parties do seem to be able to work on in the state still. They don't work on much these days. I'm sure you've seen the very antagonistic relationship between the governor and particularly Assembly Leader Voss during the pandemic. That applies to environmental policy as well. But this was one issue that they worked together on. Although again, politics kind of intruded. They did allow some regulation of PFAS chemicals. These are things used in like firefighting foam. They have a number of potential health effects. They don't degrade easily in the environment and they can contaminate groundwater. The legislator, this was recent actually, just last month, weakened the new rules that the DNR had put out for regulating these PFAS chemicals. So, so again, the conservative legislator continues to try to kind of hamstring the governor's efforts to implement stronger environmental protections. I'll conclude with saying that there's the current governor has a strong support for the DNR. Really emphasizes science-based environmental policy. He wanted to even create a division within the DNR, the science services, with scientist staff there. That was ultimately not put into the budget by Republicans. They who had control of the budget process, so they removed that. But they did get a couple more science positions at the DNR. And also the DNR, filled its environmental enforcement positions, are 100% filled. That was just 50% under Walker, which again speaks to the stance of that administration and the agency during that time. There's been a much stronger stance on Foxconn, reviewing the air quality permits, not giving them the tax credits because they did not meet the obligations under law to get those. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in regard to that. But that just speaks to the changing tone, right? It's not just the changes in policy. There's also been a dramatic shift in the tone and talking about issues like climate change and emphasizing environmental protection and clean water and things like that, as opposed to continually focusing on economic growth, even if it comes at the expense of the environment, right? That's been the shift, is the shift in tone, the shift in policy, and some shift in laws, but that's going to be harder because of the current legislature. Okay, so that's it. So I'm done with this part of the presentation, but I would love to take any questions that you may have.
I have a question, if it's okay.
Yes.
I was wondering, the law that went through for the mining company that never came is still there. Is that right? So if another mining company came along, they can just jump into that. Is that correct? Or how does that work?
No, that's correct. They changed the law. So it would be much easier, right, for another company to come in and to try to do that. You got to think though that what happened with the previous company would probably weigh on their minds, and also that the change in administration, right? So I do think it would discourage them, but it doesn't mean that they couldn't try, right? And they would certainly have the support of the legislature.
Thank you.
Okay, so maybe folks will have to unmute if they're, you'll have to, okay, Mary. We can unmute you though, there you go, I think. Maybe, I don't know.
I'm trying to do it, I can't see. I can only ask to unmute.
Oh, is that what it is? Okay.
Do you know how to unmute, Mary? There you go.
Okay, I see it now.
I can hear you.
All right, thank you, Jonah. Yes, I had a question. You were talking about, I think it was just a couple years ago, trying to have a ban on plastic bags, but I thought plastic in the environment or in our production was, how would you say, bags alone wasn't enough to make a dent because it seems like everything in the food industry, everything, cosmetic industry, everything is plastic. And I'm not after seeing a documentary that just because it's marked recycled plastic, that actually happens. And if it did happen, it would be really great to have that feedback, because I think people try to do that on a how would you say, a personal level. They try to do that, separate plastic. But what is happening on an industrial level? Is it really, if we can't stop it from happening, is it really being separated and recycled? I guess that would be my question about. It seems like it's overwhelming. It's an overwhelming task
Yeah,
to
no, it's a
recycle.
great question. Of course, the news on that is not good, but I can at least give you some positive news, which is that there was a successful effort to ban what are called the micro beads. So these are little tiny plastic beads that were being put into like cosmetic products to exfoliate skin, things like that. What they were finding, particularly in the Great Lakes, they found this, right? It was accumulating as it would come out of the wastewater treatment plants, because the stuff, it just goes through, gets down, sinks, and then it would go to the wastewater treatment, but it wasn't being filtered there. It was actually going right out into bodies of water, rivers, and the lakes. And what they found is that it was accumulating on the floor, the sediment, and that fish were eating this, right? And clams and other things, right? So this
Mhm.
stuff is being consumed, and it's harmful to them, but also, if you think about catching those fish and eating them, we would be eating the
Mhm.
plastics, right? So there's multiple reasons to be concerned about this. In fact, those things are now banned. So they moved away from that. They use more natural things, like little coconut and stuff. But so there has been some movement on some of the issues, but in terms of, as you say, I mean, we're talking about a much larger scale, right? So you're not
Mhm.
talking about just one little thing. And that's been the approach so far, has been piecemeal, right? Let's tackle it here, tackle it there. There's really not a comprehensive effort at our national level, or particularly at our state level, to do anything about the plastics issue. So that's the bad news. I tried to
Yeah.
lead with at least a little bit of good news, right? There are efforts. People do
Yeah.
recognize there are problems, but our approach thus far has been piecemeal, and it's
Mhm.
certainly not up to the task of the greater challenge of,
Yeah.
of
Thank you.
removing those plastics from particularly our food system, right? Like you
Mhm.
said, that's where they're most prevalent.
Yep. Thank you.
I have a question about Foxconn.
Mhm.
You indicated that they have not met their requirements and they are not receiving the tax credits. I don't know where else they are in the country, but would they ever just pick up and leave if they are not getting what they thought they were going to get?
Yeah, right now some of their efforts are to challenge those decisions to actually get the tax credits. So I think what they're trying right now is, we're here, it's good. We've already invested, hundreds of millions of dollars. So we want to get the money that we were promised from the state. That's what they do everywhere, right? They make these very generous deals that get public support. So they're a private company that their approach has often been, we're a private company, but we're more than happy to take public revenue, right,
Who
for
isn't?
our operations. And so they've used
Uh-huh.
that approach everywhere. I mean, this should have been known, right, that this was likely to happen. This is what they've done everywhere they've gone. And so my guess is they'll continue to try to fleece the state for some money before they just pull the plug. The Trump administration is largely what was keeping them here. There had been negotiations with the Trump administration. Walker was involved in that. But there was a lot of pressure from the Trump administration to keep them. I don't know what happens now, to be honest. I mean, the state has invested a couple hundred million as well, though, right? I mean, they've made improvements in that area. So the state doesn't necessarily want them to leave, but it also doesn't probably want the type of development that they're looking to do now, right? They wanted the development that was specified, but that's not what they're doing, right, at all. So it's really, I'm sure that Evers is conflicted on this as well, right? Do you just walk away from it, or do you try to make something with the company work? Right now, it's in a weird in between. So it'll be very interesting to see going forward what decisions are made. But yeah, they could leave. I mean, that is an option, right? They could just say, we're walking away from it. I don't know if they would leave entirely. Yeah, that may be difficult for them at this point.
Why did they pick that area of the state? Is
Oh,
that-
that's a great question. Partly, the proximity to major population centers, right? So from employment purposes, it's easier to get people from Milwaukee, Chicago, right, and have access to those areas. Partly too, because it's an area they could develop, right, along that kind of corridor, right, of development. And that, this is where a lot of the state's economy is centered around these kind of regions in the southeast of the state. But also the state legislature, designated that area, and I didn't read it, but there's what they called it was an electronics and information technology manufacturing zone. And they basically, I didn't have time to go into detail on this, that whole area that they're in is exempted from state environmental policy. So they basically carved out this exemption. Anything in that zone doesn't have to go through the traditional permitting processes for wetlands, air quality, all this stuff. That's why Evers revisited this stuff, right? And said, this actually wasn't done properly. And we have to meet certain federal minimums at least. And so that's why they had to revisit some of this stuff. So part of it was politically driven. Part of it was, economically driven for that particular location.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing this great information.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me today.
Are there any more questions? I think you did an excellent job, Jonah, outlining the history, the context, the changes, just like you said you would, and I really appreciate it. I think we can all agree that it was a great talk, and I just want to remind everybody that Diane will be sending out by email an evaluation for the speaker today, and if you could just click on those 5 quick questions and submit your email form, that would be really helpful for Jonah and for us as well. And Jonah, is there any other thing you want to add before you go, or?
I hope everybody had wonderful holidays, right? And that everyone's safe and sound. We can get through this, right? Just hang in there, right?
Yeah, we'll make it. Thank you so much. And I think we'll call it. We can stop the program. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much. Bye, everyone.